online TDC VGA. Thank you, Ware. Disclaimer, probably the most important part of this talk, especially for me. I am an attorney. I'm not your attorney. Everyone at the HC, the Hacker Consortium here, is very aware of that fact. This is not legal advice. You really, if you plan to rely on any of this, talk to an attorney in your state. I'm not licensed in this state. I'm licensed in Florida. But it's an introduction, just a little background on myself before we get started. As I said, I am an attorney. I'm also a software engineer. I was trained in software architecture. I co-founded the Azurus BitTorrent client. Some people have heard of it, some people haven't. Other than that, more importantly for this talk, I am a hacker. And that is what I like to do, most and foremost. So, an overview of what's going to go on here. We're going to talk a little bit about jurisdiction. Can everyone hear me? Can you cut the mic? Thanks. Jurisdiction, we're going to talk about jurisdiction. We're going to talk about the difference between federal jurisdiction and state jurisdiction. It's a sticky area. Some people get confused on it. We're going to talk about the Constitution and what that has to do with war driving in any way, shape, or form. What war driving is. We're going to talk a little bit at the 802.11 specification. We're going to talk about what happens when war driving and the law collide. And hopefully we'll get to a question and answer period if we have enough time, and you guys can ask me what you want to know. It's not legal advice, though. I did have a video introduction. It was a Colbert Report. It's about 5 minutes long. If you get a chance, go check it out. Just go to Colbert Report, type in cyber terrorists, and it'll come up. It's about 5 minutes long. It's pretty funny. But it's just a small clip they did on a man who was arrested for war driving outside of a shop. I'll talk about it later instead. We don't have a working wireless right now, so we're going to have to skip that. But what's jurisdiction and what does it have to do with war driving? So I assume everybody knows what jurisdiction is vaguely? All right. Well, in the U.S., we have a common law jurisprudence system, and as you know, there are federal and state levels. A lot of people get confused on that in the sense of they think that the Supreme Court of the United States is the controlling court of all law. It's not true. The Supreme Court only decides federal law, and it only collides with state law when there's a federal law involved. So you hear a lot of times earlier about a case going up to the Supreme Court, and it'll be based on due process, a murder case, a capital case, something like that. And the only reason the Supreme Court gets to decide on it is because there's some constitutional basis, some federal basis. Other than that, your state Supreme Court is the final say of the laws. So if you have a state law and it goes up to court, it goes up to the state Supreme Court, it stops there if that's the last, if there's no federal issues. So states decide their own laws. Federal governments decide their own laws. The Supreme Courts of each, the federal or the state, decide the final say. There's no mixing unless there's a federal issue involved. Then it can transfer from the state court to the federal court. Oh, wow. There we go. All right. And there are also jurisdictions within jurisdictions. So you've got circuit courts, district courts, appellate courts, etc. Now from there, what's that have to do with any of this? Well, first we'll go through a little example. So you've got the Ninth Circuit. We've all heard about the Ninth Circuit and their crazy decisions. Now, a lot of people think that the Ninth Circuit, what they say applies. That's not true. Each jurisdiction within those jurisdictions, so you've got the federal government, you've got the Ninth Circuit, which is California, Oregon, a couple other states in that area. The Sixth Circuit, which is Tennessee, Ohio, and I believe Iowa. A case decided in the Ninth Circuit, the appellate court of the Ninth Circuit, has no bearing on the Sixth Circuit other than it's persuasive. So the Ninth Circuit could say one thing, medical marijuana is legal. The Sixth Circuit can say it's illegal. And the only way that gets decided, it gets settled, is if the Supreme Court chooses to accept the case and resolves the conflict, and then that's the final say on the federal law. Other than that, it's just very persuasive effect. So one jurisdiction, even within Tennessee, for example, if one side of Tennessee says something, there's a middle of, I think there's a west, a middle, and a east district here. And if the east district said one thing and the west district said another, they can completely do that. That's not a problem. And it's only settled when the Supreme Court chooses to decide that. And that's important to keep in mind when you're addressing all of this, specifically because the laws are going to change. What I'm going to tell you here and what I'm going to show you here, something will change. And tomorrow, whatever I've said may or may not apply. And the best thing that I can do for you is to try to explain how to analyze the law and what's going on, how these cases apply. So keep in mind that if you hear something about the Ninth Circuit deciding it, it doesn't mean that it necessarily applies to where you are. So state and federal issues. How do we determine what is a state and federal issue? And the simple answer is it's the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States decide what it is. And obviously the Supreme Court of the United States decides what the Constitution says, so it's what they say also. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So the Constitution. Who's heard of the Constitution? Come on up, I know you have. All right. Who knows a decent amount about the Constitution? All right. We're going to have a little fun then. All right. How many articles does the Constitution contain? Anyone? 7. There's 7 articles, plus a preamble and the signatures and the amendments. How many amendments are there? 27. Where was it? Well played. 26 after one's been repealed, but there are 27 officially listed still. All right. Does anyone actually, this isn't in there, but does anyone know when the last amendment was added? What year the last amendment was ratified? Most of us were alive. 1992 was the last amendment added. It had to do with congressional pay. And you want to realize how fast government works? The amendment was proposed in, I believe, 1789. Just took a little while to get through, just a little while, a couple of years. It was actually proposed, I believe, by James Madison, so if that does anything for you. Anyone know what the first 10 amendments are called? There we go. We got some. Good. We know something. So the Bill of Rights. Now, here's a fun one. Who likes guns? Op 4, you better put up your hand. All right. Everybody likes guns. What's the Second Amendment known for? Okay. Here's the follow-up. Does it? You sure? But why? It does. The Constitution grants you rights, or no, it will secure. It does actually grant copyright specifically in the area of laws. It does grant limitations on what governments can do. So the Second Amendment, obviously known for the right to bear arms, for example, did not apply to the states. For example, Tennessee. The Second Amendment has not actually been incorporated yet. There's what's known as an incorporation doctrine. The incorporation doctrine came after the Civil War. There were 3 amendments added. Does anyone know which 3 of those were? It was the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment added the prohibition against slavery. The 14th Amendment added due process and equal protection to the states. It applied the Bill of Rights to the states or selectively applied them. And the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Does anyone know when women were given the right to vote? The 19th Amendment, and it was August something, 1920. I believe it's not. Yeah, August 20th, 1920. Years later. But what's important from that is in the 14th Amendment, until then, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. So you did not have a freedom of speech, you did not have freedom of religion, you did not have any, specifically not listed there, but you did not have a right to bear arms. And even till today, there's no specific right to bear arms incorporated to the states, except that the recent case Columbia v. Heller in 2008, there's a lot of talk that the Supreme Court may have incorporated the Second Amendment rights into states' rights, specifically because they said that it was a personal right, and most personal rights have been included. We'll get to why all this matters. Back to the point. So the Constitution grants Congress the power, or powers, over certain things. For example, this is the specific wording, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. It's colloquially referred to as the Commerce Clause. It regulates just about everything, and we'll discuss that in a minute. Almost every law you see passed is under this clause. You actually brought this up a moment ago. They're also specifically granted rights to protect intellectual property. That is in the Constitution. Patents, copyrights, and trademarks are listed, amazingly. This is known as the Commerce Clause, or not the Commerce Clause, the Copyrights Clause is what it's usually referred to as. And finally, this was one of the more battled sections of the Constitution, but it specifically states, it's referred to as the Necessary and Proper Clause, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Basically, this was added specifically so that Congress could add auxiliary laws or small extensions on their power to enforce those laws. And that's where we get a lot, I do mean a lot of the laws that we have now, especially relating to war driving, hacking, etc., which is why all this is going to come in. So you've got the Commerce Clause, which specifically is the basis for medical marijuana cases, the FCC, highways, gun control, almost everything Congress does. Intellectual properties, obviously, we all know the DMCA. Everyone? All right. If not, read it because you're here. The laws which are necessary and proper to enforce. So people and state powers. The powers not everything not listed to Congress is given to the states or reserved to the states and the people. Or everything not prohibited also is included. So the powers not delegated to the United States, blah, blah, blah. And that's where we get our state laws, and those state laws apply. For example, no states have copyright laws anymore because Congress has said that they've preempted them. And what that means is that their all-inclusive copyright bills that they've passed in 1976 and before that, those laws control the entire U.S. Those laws are uniform, and that is it. You deal with copyrights, you deal with the federal government. Your state used to have copyright laws until they were preempted by Congress. Congress said no more, and that's where we get. The area of war driving, wireless, etc., computer security, encryption has not been taken over by that. There are several state laws which will apply, and we'll discuss that. So what does all that have to do? Nothing really, but it does have to do with the legal analysis, and that's what's important here. We're going to be talking about the legality of war driving, not specifically if war driving is legal, but more along the lines of how to gauge what is and what isn't legal. And hopefully we can all walk away getting some clue about it. So who knows what war driving is? Good, otherwise we'd have to throw you out. The definition. The act, this is a rough definition, mind you, the act of searching for Wi-Fi, also referred to as Wi-Fi in France, and that is true, by the way. Wireless networks by a person in a moving vehicle. I can tell you a funny story. I was at Disney World Paris, and someone kept saying, do you need Wi-Fi? And I couldn't figure out what they were talking about until finally they pointed at my laptop, and I realized what they were discussing. It took a little while. I didn't get thrown out of the park. It was all as well. But, so searching for wireless or from a moving vehicle. Who's heard of war flying, war kayaking, war karting? There's a lovely one if you take a shopping cart. I'm not suggesting this, but if you take a shopping cart with a laptop, it can be good times. Just saying. But so who knows where the phrase war driving comes from? War dialing, which came from? Who's seen War Games? Everyone else get out. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I don't know if we're showing it here, but we should be. It is a great, great movie. I'm sure it inspired at least a few people in here. But there was an all-important scene in there where he was war dialing, which actually I don't know what they called it before that. But basically, everyone knows what war dialing is. So he was making phone calls, and that got called war dialing because of War Games, and now we have war everything. So how is war driving possible? If you actually read the specifications for 802.11, which I have, I don't really recommend it. They're entertaining if you're a nerd. Other than that, it does specify that access points, APs as they're referred to, are they broadcast beacon packets as they're known, or beacon frames. And these beacon packets contain every piece of information you need to connect to that wireless access point. So it'll send you the SSID, it'll send you the encryption scheme that's used, et cetera, and will even include some vendor-specific information which can be used for forensic analysis to identify what it is, if you care. There's also probe packets. Probe packets are sent back from your machine to the AP asking for additional information, and you can gather some extra information. If you're just monitoring beacon packets, that's known as passive scanning. If you're sending probe packets, it's known as active scanning. Doesn't sound like a big distinction, but it can be important when you get to the legalities of it. And as you know, lawyers are filled and happy when it comes to little anal-retentive things. So pay attention. There's passive and active. In all honesty, when it gets down to it, the laws don't really distinguish too much, but it is important. What isn't war driving? War driving is not, and the media gets this wrong all the time, as you're very aware, I'm sure. And I'll try to keep it correct, but war driving is not piggybacking, aka taking someone else's wireless. Don't raise your hands, but I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about. Network intrusion. No one knows anything about that here, right? Packet sniffing? No one, right? Good. And anything beyond just discovery of the access points. Now, a lot of times in the news you'll hear XYZ was arrested for war driving. That is incorrect. No one ever been arrested for war driving. They may have been arrested while war driving, but not for war driving. Well, unless it was just really erratic, a reckless war driving maybe, I don't know.
What about drinking and war driving?
Yeah, drinking and war driving. I mean, Ware has gotten close to, if you threw the laptop off the top again, Ware, we could make that something. War falling, I don't know. But, yeah, war streaking, very important. So when war driving meets the law, this is the meat of this, and we'll try to go through this a little slow. What do you guys want? Do you want to take questions during or after? All right, we'll just call it on the fly then. So federal laws. These are the federal laws that cover war driving. There's only a few, and a few that you think would apply don't. For example, the DMCA does not really have much to do with wireless packets or etc. It deals mostly with copyrights, and you wouldn't be violating copyrights. I mean, you try to get a stretch on it, but it's not going to happen. It also deals with some encryption techniques or decrypting. And if you're decrypting packets, you're really not going to fall under a DMCA. So a lot of people think the DMCA would cover this, but it doesn't. So the FCFAA, also known as the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. If you're charged with this, it's not a good thing. Scott Moulton, is he here? He was here earlier. He'll be giving a talk later. I'll actually reference one of his cases. He brought a case against someone under the FCCA. So if you want more questions about this, talk to him. I'm sure he doesn't want to talk about it, but you're welcome to ask him because it's funny. What does this cover? It covers unauthorized access, and that's a very, very important phrase, and you'll hear it often, you'll hear it a lot. Almost anyone who's charged with a computer crime, state or federal, it is under the unauthorized computer access clause of their statutes, whatever those statutes are. If you're trying to determine what the statute is in your state, look for those phrases. Do a search on their statutes and look for unauthorized access. You'll most likely find in the criminal law section, and it will fall under computer use or computer access crimes. That's the best way to get started. From there, you can usually find what other statutes you're looking for. What else does it cover? Exceeding granted access, a.k.a. you're given a base login to a Unix system, you bump yourself up to root, you may be subject to the FCFAA Act. Intent to a fraud or obtain anything of value. There is a $5,000 damage limit. Most people won't fall under that. Intentionally, recklessly, or negligently harming a computer. It's an interesting distinction, and they add all three of those because it basically means being a dipshit. If you're a dipshit and hurt a computer, but you did it with the intent to know you weren't there, you may be subject to this act, or your state law parallels. The Electronic Communication Protections Act. Anti-interception law, a.k.a. wiretapping or interception. It covers both terrestrial and electronic communications. It was updated, so it's just not phone lines. It does include cell phones. It does include wireless phones, and it does include wireless. Yes? The FCC does have control over some of the regulations on this. Is this act? Well, technically, I don't know if there's any provisions. The FCC just handles administration regulations, so they can send out notifications on what they believe the law means. We think it says this. We won't talk about this, or we don't regulate these parts of the spectrum. But this is technically for those. It's prosecuted by the USDA, as always, the United States District Attorneys. But the law is controlled by Congress. The FCC would have some administrative powers over it. Also found in the Constitution of who gets what powers, if you care. But important to note with those mostly fall under the Commerce Clause, a.k.a. they only apply if it interferes with, can interfere with, or does impact interstate commerce. So if you're in Tennessee and you're sniffing wireless in Kentucky, you might be talking to the feds. Otherwise, unless you're interrupting interstate commerce, that law may not apply. But it's extremely broad. There are a lot of cases defining that. We could literally go on for 10 hours talking about the Commerce Clause, so we're just going to gloss over that one. Happy to talk about it later, though. Trust me, I love to argue that one. It's fun. State laws. There is almost always the state equivalent of the federal laws. States don't like the law, or who likes their legislators? Anyone? I don't think so. All right, well, legislators are lazy. I don't know if you've noticed, but they are extremely lazy. So the first time someone passes a law somewhere, most states pick it up. The federal laws are usually, if you look at the state laws, they're almost always the exact equivalent of the federal laws. There's actually groups that go around and say, you should pass our laws. It's pretty entertaining. They go to every state. You will see many examples of that. But those two previous laws, the CFAA and the ECPA, these there are almost always state equivalents. You will have state wiretapping laws. You will have state computer access laws, unauthorized access laws, etc. In addition, who knows what a tort is? You've heard the word a lot on the news, I'm sure, but a tort specifically is usually a damage to a person or property. It's some kind of action that is recoverable. It's a damage. And these are tort laws. So not only can you be subject to criminal laws, there is also civil equivalents, misappropriation of services, invasion of privacy, trespassing chattels. You know what a chattel is? It's a piece of property. It's just a fancy legal word for a piece of property. Theft of services, and there's probably a bajillion other things they could charge you with. So there you go. But what's important about this, and I think it's the next slide, yeah, there's criminal and civil penalties. Almost every law I've mentioned has a criminal component where you can be charged with either a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on what they think you've done, or civilly. And I believe Scott Moulton's case was actually a civil case that he brought against VC3, seeking damages for, I think it was defamation, technically, and they filed back into the CFAA. But keep in mind, not only can you be arrested, but you could also be sued by someone. Very important distinction. So, does anyone know what mens rea is? All right. Well, it's Latin for the guilty mind, and this is an extremely important part of this, and this is really what most of this is going to come down to. Mens rea, it's your mental intent at the time, what you intended to do. So specific intent crimes, theft, burglary, attempt, they all require that you specifically intended that action to occur. General intent, something like battery. I may want to hit Op4, and that's fine. But if I didn't want to hurt him, but I hit him, that's still a battery. I didn't intend harm, but I did intend the battery. Whereas a specific intent crime, to steal something, it's the intent to permanently deprive. If I pick up this connector here and I walk off with it, but I didn't mean to keep it, I just happened to take it, and I kept it forever, it's still not theft. I didn't intend it. But if I intended to steal this and I walked off with it, I only got to the door and one of the security guys beat the crap out of me, I still committed a theft because I intended that crime. And then, yes, technically he did commit a battery, but he'd probably get away with it on defensive property. Not legal advice. No one beat the crap out of him. Strict liability, a.k.a. Statutory rape. They don't care if you saw the license. They don't care if they said they were 18. They don't care anything. You did it. You're guilty. There is no intent word in those statutes. There never will be. There never are. Another strict liability is also used in torts. The classic example is blasting. If someone's blowing up something next to you, that's a very dangerous activity. They're strictly liable for those damages. Even if they set up barriers and everything, that company that blew up your car is going to get in trouble. Yeah. The laws do work sometimes. So, for example, we got some examples here. These are actual words from the Tennessee statutes. A person commits theft of property if he, with intent to deprive, the owner of property, blah, blah, blah. That is a specific intent. That is theft, with the intent to deprive. So he committed some act with the intent, the specific intent. This is a general intent. This is also the preamble to the Security or the Computer Fraud Act in Tennessee. Whoever intentionally and without authorization, directly or indirectly. So they intended to do something, but they didn't specifically intend the result. And you'll notice if you read the rest of the statute, it starts listing off parts, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So intent, authorization, and access. Those are three keywords to keep in mind if you're dealing with wardriving or any computer fraud crime. Intent, usually defined as, did you mean to do it? I mean, in common terms, mind you. Did you mean to do what you did? Was it an accident, or did you intend it? Could you have prevented it and didn't? AKA, did you know it was going to happen, you did nothing about it? Sometimes that can be construed as intent. And was it done accidentally, AKA you drove into someone's, well, trespass is a bad example, but just for usage here. Did you drive into someone's yard accidentally and just decided to stay there? Can be considered intent because you noticed what happened and you didn't leave. Technically, if you drive into someone's driveway, you are guilty of a trespass, even though you intended to do it. Now, if someone drove you off the road and you swerved into the drive, you wouldn't. But we won't talk about that. Yeah, I swerved right into your Wi-Fi. I swear it was an accident. Authorization and access, it's somewhat of a gradient. They kind of mix in. Even the statutes in Tennessee get it wrong, technically, what they're trying to say. They're not synonymous. They are two very separate things. But what's important to know here is that they are interconnected. There is some play between them. So authorization or access, were you given permission to do what you did? If not, it was probably unauthorized. Did you interact with the system? AKA, did you go further than just looking at it? And we'll talk about some of the cases on that. And there are differing viewpoints, and it's very, very important. Your state defines what authorization and access is, usually in statutes. Lots of statutes leave them blank. We are a common law jurisdiction, as I mentioned. The U.S. is a common law system, as I mentioned, which means the courts decide what that means if the legislature doesn't. I worked for some courts, and I can guarantee you that I've met legislatures who said, no, we left that out. Specifically, we wanted the courts to define it. So a lot of times there will not be definitions for these things, and the courts will throw it up and decide. There are two mindsets, if you will, on what is the default, what it means in your state. Some states believe that authorization is defaultly permitted if it is left unencrypted and left open. Some states believe that authorization is denied. You may see it, you may not touch. And it really depends on your state. Tennessee happens to be a state where it is default access is granted. They added this, I believe it was in 2000 and I don't remember what year it was. Does anyone know? 2004, 2001, somewhere in there. This was amended to the Computer Crimes Law, and it is operating a computer network in such a way as to allow anonymous access to that network shall constitute implicit consent to access under this part. Now, probably they should have put access and authorization, but they just put access, which can be assumed authorization, I would guess. I don't think it's ever been tested. But what's important about this is Tennessee has created a presumption that if someone has left open their network, if there is an open wireless point, they intended it to be used and accessed by the general public. That's not saying go out there and steal everyone's Wi-Fi, but in Tennessee, this is what the law says. It does not grant you, however, and this is extremely important, it does not grant you the access to violate other laws. You cannot misappropriate their services, you cannot trespass, you cannot start wiretapping, etc.
How do they define anonymous?
Anonymous,
As in, allow anonymous access. Because there's a difference between encrypted, so you obfuscate access, and anonymous, where you actually have identity associated.
well, I assume in their definition, I haven't pulled up the actual legislative intent. I'm sure it's at the Supreme Court down the street, though. The anonymous access, I assume they mean an unknown person, aka someone anonymous to the owner or the operator, someone unknown to them, and they intended that. A great example of this would be a coffee shop. And actually that Colbert clip I was going to show you, which is a great point to explain that, they make fun of it and they poke fun of it, but it's not very funny. An off-duty firefighter, he was a community firefighter, he had stopped every morning, he would stop in front of a wireless shop that had free Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi, and he would check his email. The entertaining part was, as he explains, he was checking his email for he was the secretary for the local bagpipe club, so he was checking to see what was going on with the bagpipe group. But he was pulled up there, and an officer saw him doing something and was like, oh, I'm sure there's a law being broken, checked in the car, asked him what he was doing, said he was using the wireless. He was charged under unauthorized access. And in that state, I believe it was Louisiana, but I'm not sure, I can't remember honestly. But he was charged, and he pled guilty to it, as most people do, just to avoid severe penalties, because it's usually a felony. It's a 5-year felony, large fine, $250,000 or $10,000, depending on your statute. He pled guilty, got $250 fine and a year of probation. But still, that's pretty hefty. But in that state, they did not granted this. It was not assumed that it was anonymous. And since he hadn't paid for the services, he was unauthorized. He hadn't gone in and bought coffee. He hadn't asked for permission. He was unauthorized, and he did it intentionally. He pled guilty, so there was no specific case finding on that, but he did plead out, which means it does have some weight to it. Tennessee, as I said, this is their laws. Florida, for example, does not define this. Florida people have been arrested for unauthorized access. I've yet to see a case actually go to trial. I believe the prosecution would probably drop it before it ever did, or people usually plead out before it gets there. Access. What is access? Very, very important. And there's a classic case, State v. Allen. You'll see this in any discussion of computer fraud crimes, etc. War dialing is not equal to access. In this case, basically, someone had gone out and was war dialing. They'd hit a Bell South system. The Bell South asked for a prompt, a password prompt. He didn't type anything. He disconnected, marked it down, continued on. The charges were brought against him, and the court said that merely dialing in and looking at the system and not doing anything was not access. He didn't do anything to it. He did not access. He was merely within. They found that he wasn't even in proximity of it. He didn't do anything. There was no intent there. And that kind of set the pace. Then you got Moulton, Scott Moulton. I don't think he's here yet. He's somewhere. I saw him earlier. Versus VC3. Port scanning. The case didn't specifically decide that port scanning was not access, but it basically implies that port scanning machine is not considered access. They actually found on a constitutional basis that the statute was too broad. It was too vague. It did not provide due process under what access was defined at. It could have been anything. Merely walking. In State v. Allen, they actually at one point say that if they would have gone with the definition the prosecution was asking for, walking next to a computer could have been considered a computer crime as you attempted to access it. Luckily, someone had some brains and said no. On the side, in Scott's case, there was a part of the decision where they specifically addressed whether calling the other companies, I assume VC3's employees were stupid, was not defamation. Could be useful to some of us. I'm sure I would have used that at some point. So access, it's important to know, requires something more than just probing or just looking at it. Access is accessing. Usually if you use your common sense, you can kind of guess. And in this case, it's pretty blatant. Sure.
Is there a line of access, meaning content versus service?
It's honestly a gray area. It's not very well defined. These cases usually don't go to trial, which leaves everything up. I would think there was a line, but there's no real specific jurisprudence on it. I think the deeper you get into interacting with it, the more you're conversing with the system, the more you're accessing that system. Or if you're trying to work with a service, I would say you're accessing. There have been cases that say with website browsing, using the case and using the information was accessing it, but it wasn't unauthorized if it was given out there. Does that make sense? So there was a service, there's a web service available, and somebody used it. It wasn't inappropriate, but it was access. Not really on point, though, for this. Interception. So we talked about the first three. Did you have a question? Sure.
I think how many wireless networks I've seen that are out there that people have their public folders on the computer shared out across open network or main systems, whatever.
Yeah.
And then even your public folder, I'm guessing, would be considered authorized access, even if it's publicly shared on that network and network.
My guess, and again, it's not legal advice, my guess would be it would be unauthorized access. The best thing you can always do is always ask permission. The law is against the old adage of ask permission afterwards. It's not true. Accessing their network is not what that law grants you. That law grants you access to use them as an access point and a gateway through to the internet. Potentially, the court hasn't decided it, so no one really knows what it grants you, but that's what the intent was. It does not grant you access to their files. That would be browsing around and probably unauthorized access to their network. Public folder? Well, that's where things get tricky. And even though it was broadcast as a public share, most likely, I would assume, my guess would be, and I don't think it's ever been decided, is that a court would find it was unauthorized access, specifically because they didn't tell you could do it. And people's files, as we all know, Windows likes to share things on occasion. I run a Mac, I'm fine, but my guess would be that it would probably fall under unauthorized access, specifically because they didn't tell you could get to the files, and you were using someone else's network. Now, if you're at work, you're obviously granted access to go in there. Sure. Yes, that would be a very applicable place. So we talked about the ECPA. This is the Wiretap Act, as it's referred to. The Wiretap Act, the most important thing for that is interception. What is the definition of interception? An unauthorized interception. And just a small aside here, state statutes a lot of times apply, and they have their own wiretapping. Some states, federal requires one person to know that it's being taped, a call, for example. So a federal, if you go to a post office and make a call from there, as long as you know it's being taped, it's fine. If you're calling someone and taping the conversation, that could be fine, not legal advice. But a lot of states, for Florida, for example, requires both parties to know before it can be taped. So if you ever try to tape a phone call, if you don't have to, don't. But if you do, definitely check your statute, especially if you're standing in like the White House or something. That's federal court. Who knows what they change day to day. But the ECPA specifically defines interception as acquisition of the contents of any electronic communication through the use of any electronic, mechanical, or other devices. What the fuck does that mean? Basically, if you're listening, you're in trouble. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. There's actually been cases where people had police scanners, and they were just using them, and they'd run into people's wireless phone calls because you can pick up the range in the radio. And the cases basically say, and I think it's in here somewhere, actually I think I left that out, but basically what the cases will tell you is if you come by someone's phone call by accident, if you're just scanning through and you hit a phone call and you go, change it, you're fine. But if you're like, that was pretty juicy, and go back to it, then you're probably wiretapping and in trouble. But what's interesting here is this Watkins case, is they talk about the violation of the law is the interception itself. It's not particularly what you tape. So if you're just looking at any packets, anything, there are cases that basically say probe and beacon packets are all right. But if you're looking at anything beyond that, it's not that you actually analyzed it or you cared what the contents were, that you were looking for credit cards or whatever. It's that you actually just intercepted it under this case. Now, this isn't completely applicable because this dealt with the wiretapping statute, but it most likely is extremely persuasive jurisprudence. Yes?
Here's another question. How about packet inspection by ISPs?
Well, they're granted under the DMCA, they have certain common carrier protections, and they're allowed to do certain things with that under the DMCA because of their status as an ISP. Basically, to keep their protection, though, they're required not to modify those packets, but they can analyze it. My guess would be, and I'm not sure on the specifics of this, but my guess would be that because you're sending it to them intentionally, that you've granted them access to look at it since they have to route it. At least if I was an internet provider, that's what I would argue. You did sign that. Yeah, I assume the DMCA has a provision in there. I've read it a couple times. I can't think of something allowing deep access, deep packet scanning. But I assume an ISP, since you're sending it to them, would have an implied right to. John?
One thing that gets me on occasion is somebody will post a message in a public forum, whether it's YouTube or whatever, and it'll have boilerplate at the bottom. This material is confidential.
Is it very confidential?
No one else is supposed to look at it.
Yeah, I always love those. This is confidential information. Don't read it. I'm gonna.
How is this interpreted with unintentional broadcast, interception with unintentional broadcast?
Well, usually the laws are defined, and I'm not actually sure under the ECMP. I believe it is an unintentional. Actually, I don't think it requires intentional or unintentional. For example, if anyone uses shortwave radio, unintentional access to those radios can be a problem if you broadcast over them.
Unintentional interception of unintentional broadcast.
Oh, if you intentionally catch something that someone unintentionally sent?
Specifically meaning tempest and keyboard radiation.
The EM radiation. Yeah, the EMF radiations, I assume that would actually probably fall under the Wiretap Act, specifically because you are intercepting a communication. I would argue, I worked as a prosecutor for a while. I don't any longer, obviously. But
it's not hard to hold fast yet.
no, I don't think I've ever seen anything on the Tempest systems, but my guess would be that if you were scanning someone's typing into a keyboard, they would interpret that as a communication. The machine was communicating, the keyboard was communicating to the machine into somewhere else, and you tapped into it. Probably would fall under it, would be my guess. It's a toss-up, but it's close. Yes?
I knew a guy we both call him Bob. He
Bob.
wanted an article on what actually was across the Ford network.
Okay, Tor, yeah.
He looked at legal side of this. Bob saw that it's quite illegal to look at that traffic either from at the point.
Oh, yeah.
To monitor or quality of service.
Exactly. Usually the provisions, like the DMCA makes provisions to monitor and make sure the network's running okay, and if you have to have all that, blah, 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 if you're a common carrier. And what they define an ISP as is basically anybody who's a router, just a gateway or router. I mean, you can set up a Tor node and you'd be an ISP under the DMCA usually. Yeah, you can't really go in and try to determine what they're doing would be my guess. If you're trying to figure out what they were sending or what was in there, if you're packet sniffing, you probably would run into a wiretap issue. Yeah, if there's a statute that authorized you to, you could, obviously. But that's a tough world. Keylogger on there. I mean, I've seen keylogger cases, so my guess would probably be not, but I couldn't tell you why right now. I'd have to research it, in all honesty. I'm not too familiar with it. Happy to look it up, though, and get back to you. John? I don't know. I would assume under this law it probably sounds like it was. I mean, under this decision, it sounds like just intercepting it, whether you communicated with someone else or not. There's no discussion in this case about communication to a third party. So I'd assume that it probably shifted if that was actually the state of law before. Sure. Yeah, packet sniffing is basically wiretapping. The equivalents are, if you haven't gotten permission to look at those packets, you're probably violating some wiretapping law would be my guess. You can always call the state prosecutors and ask. They may not want to talk to you because they're busy people, but it is their job, they're public servants. You can ask them. You can also write to different departments and ask for a decision. For example, there's an FBI opinion on the state of wardriving. The most important part is identifying the presence of a wireless network may not be a criminal violation. You ever notice that almost everything I say may or may not, I qualify? That's a lawyer game. The state of the law is very much in flux, and we don't ever like to commit ourselves to anything. AKA the FBI, this guy he was a special agent, but he definitely had some legal background. May not be a criminal violation because it may under state laws. However, there may be criminal violations, blah, blah, blah. This is if you go beyond just looking at it, you're probably going to get in trouble. So that's what the FBI tells you, that ward driving specifically, just looking practice points, probably they're not going to prosecute. So, conclusion, to wrap it up, passive ward driving is probably legal. Active ward driving probably is too. Sending out those probe packets isn't going to cause any harm. It's not going to do any damage. You're just trying to figure out what's there. You're probably all right. Piggybacking really depends on your jurisdiction. Tennessee, most likely all right under the statute. Florida, not. You will be arrested. Packet sniffing, probably illegal. Just in general, looking at somebody else's packets, you're probably subject to some unauthorized access, intentional unauthorized access, or a wiretapping bill. That would be my assumption. Nefarious deeds, we won't define those, but probably illegal. You go onto a network and start playing around in people's public folders, you're probably in trouble. But, no, it's... I would agree. I'm with you. I'm just, I'm on the side of the law.
We should not sell Windows to the general public.
I'm all for that. Trust me. I have a Macintosh. I was a Windows junkie for a long time, a Linux guy, and I gotta say, just a little shout out. These are so much nicer. They're just happy. They're cute and they're pretty. I don't care what you think, but the OS is just it is lovely. No, but again, the most important part of the talk. I am an attorney. I am not your attorney. This was not legal advice in any way, shape, or form. In all honesty, if you are going to act on any of this, you really should talk to an attorney in your state that is licensed and is much more familiar with the laws. I don't care if it's a state prosecutor. I don't care if it's someone else. If you're going to start doing some of this, ask about it. And the best thing you can do, in all honesty, is get permission. If you want to start packet sniffing a network to do security analysis, set up your own. If you want to ward drive, you're probably all right. If you want to do any more than that, ask somebody. Excuse me, Mr. Bank, can I look at your wireless? I can almost tell you the answer, but it's worth asking. That's about it. Are there any questions, though, before I skedaddle?
Did you cover any anonymity providers out of there?
Tor or...
Yeah, like, or proxies that are intentionally concealing information. Can you have any, are you liable for any, like, terrorist anonymity service?
There's a lot of discussion about that, actually. I don't think there's been a case on it yet.
Like, can you get in trouble for using it?
Most likely, from what I've seen, no. For the same reason that, using Tor. If you're using Tor for a nefarious reason and they catch you, yeah, you're in trouble for it. But if you're if you're a Tor node and someone does something through you, there are provisions in the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act, the DMCA, that says as long as you follow the safe harbor rules, you're not liable for what other people do in your machines. You want to make sure you qualify for those safe harbor rules, obviously. But that's how people like Comcast, like if I go, hack the Chinese government, not that I've ever done that, but if I did through Tor or Comcast, it wouldn't be their fault if they fell under the safe harbor provisions. I will make a short aside, I'll get to you in a second, that I thought it was interesting with the deep packet shaping, actually. You were talking about that one of the definitions of the safe harbor provisions that you can't intercept and modify the stream. Or not the stream, but the packets, the information traveling through. But when Comcast was shaping those packets, obviously I worked on Azure, so I'm familiar with that. I always thought it was an interesting thought experiment to figure out if they violated their safe harbor provision in the sense of did they lose their safe harbor by changing it? Yeah, it basically was a man-in-the-middle attack, and they did shape the packets. But the interesting part is they didn't change the packets. They only injected a reset. They injected a packet into the stream.
But packets they were injecting were fraudulent.
Oh, they were completely. Oh, yeah. No, they completely spoofed it. No doubt there. But the way the statute is worded is pretty interesting in the sense of it says the information. It doesn't say if you can modify the stream. So it really comes down to whether the stream was if modifying the stream counts as modifying the information. But if they did lose their safe harbor provision, the funny part is that everybody that was getting their music pirated, not that anyone does it on BitTorrent, but if anyone was pirating music or movies on BitTorrent, the interesting part is if Comcast did lose their safe harbor provision under that, the music and movie industries, not that they ever would, could have sued Comcast under a contributing to infringement. I always thought I meant to write a note on that, but I never got around to it. But wait. Who wants to win? Who wants to go first?
Either way, the FAA is talking about putting NATO 2 in the air now.
Yes, I've seen it.
How is this, any of the interpretations, specifically the 802 stuff, how is that going to affect things up there?
Who has control over the lines? That most likely be federal laws.
I'm talking about all the other fools that run Windows with everything open on the plane. And they end up in odd holes and all these different...
Oh, well, it would probably be under the same rules. Yeah, if you're all sitting here sharing out each other's networks, they assume the same laws that apply on the law. Well, it depends what jurisdiction you're over. If you're flying over Louisiana, you're probably subject to Louisiana's laws and the federal laws. Well, if you're over the Atlantic, there are laws that say if you're on a U.S. plane, you're subject to the jurisdiction of the place that it departed from. Hold on one second. Is it in federal district? I know you can personally serve someone on a plane. I don't know what the height requirements were. But if you need to give personal service to someone, if you want jurisdiction in whatever state, you can find them on a plane and slap it to them when they are over whatever state you're wanting to serve them in. There is a federal case that says that they had proper jurisdiction on that. Yeah, I would. Anything that's doing more than just looking for beacon packets, I would probably turn off. I'm obviously paranoid, but I think people here are too. Sure. Actually, I'm working on compiling all the wardriving statutes and all of the computer fraud access statutes, but it's a pretty big task, so I haven't finished it yet, and PhrakNIC came up quicker than I planned, but as always. But no, not that I've seen. There's no uniform spot. The hard part with those kind of sites is maintaining them. These laws do change quite often. But I think my time is up. However, I will be around later tonight if anyone has any more questions. I'll most likely be wearing a white beater. I'm not normally in a suit. Well, I am, but not for here. So I will see you guys tonight. I appreciate it. If you guys need any more information, let me know.